A village girl saved the prince's life, but was condemned to silence forever. The sun hung low over Kenton Hollow, gilding the common green in a mellow gold that softened even the chipped corners of the village well. Bunting in faded reds and blues fluttered overhead, knotted to beams and poles, and children chased each other barefoot around the tables, stacked with spiced buns and curd tarts. The midsummer gathering had begun hours earlier, but Ceres Ashdown had lingered in the shadows of the smithy, feigning interest in the herb sprigs she carried in a basket looped over her arm. She had bathed that morning, brushed out her thick chestnut waves until they gleamed like polished oak, and bound them tightly in a ribbon the color of old parchment. Her gown was the least stained she owned. Plain wool, dyed a deep moss green that made her gray-blue eyes look almost pale. It was not finery, but she'd hoped it might make her seem less strange, less like the orphan who whispered to herself while stirring nettle root into boiling clay pots, less like the girl who had once written questions about the humors of the body into the margins of a borrowed Bible. She stepped forward now with a bundle of linen, her hands scrubbed raw from preparing them. Inside were salves, tinctures, and bandaged strips for the infirmary cart. The apothecary's boy had fallen ill that week, and she had stayed up nights, compounding mixtures from her aunt's old remedies. She approached the local steward, holding out the cloth. "For the sick cart," she murmured, but loud enough to be heard over the fiddle music. The steward blinked, eyes narrowing beneath bushy gray brows. "You again," he muttered. "Don't you think we've healers enough, Miss Ashdown?" Before she could respond, a tight, sharp voice rang out from behind her. "She thinks she's better than the rest of us." Ceres turned slowly. 3 young women stood at the edge of the crowd, all in satin-trimmed dresses and fresh curls, and at the center was Marilla Bray, daughter of the village magistrate. Her blue eyes were ice and amusement. "She treats sick children in the street without being asked, doles out root and vinegar like she's the bishop's wife," Marilla continued, stepping closer. "Perhaps she fancies herself a white witch. Or has she decided she's half noble now, with all her books and potions?" "I don't," Karis tried, but her voice faltered. The crowd was listening now. Laughter broke in small, sharp ripples. "Let her speak," Marilla said with mock graciousness, gesturing. "Let her explain why a girl with no name, no trade, and no husband dares to play physician before us all." Ceres flushed scarlet, her arms stiff at her sides. She could feel the weight of every eye like a stone pressed to her chest. She had tended to a feverish child only that morning, dabbing cool cloths to the boy's head outside the baker's shop because his mother had cried for help. She had saved the boy's breath, but it didn't matter. "I only wish to help," she said softly. "A likely story." Marilla turned to the gathering. "We all know what your aunt whispered in the dark and what they say about your mother." "Enough," Karis whispered, the words burning her tongue. But the laughter rose again, louder this time, and someone called, "Be off with you, little owl. Go back to your herbs." She turned then, before her tears betrayed her. She moved fast, shouldering past the watching crowd, past the hams roasting on open spits and the bright tables of pear cider, until the music and the air itself seemed too thick to breathe. She crossed the edge of the square, down the side lane toward the hedgerows, and didn't stop until her boots struck wild grass. She fled toward the cliffs. The path narrowed as the sun slipped further behind the ridge. The air tasted of brine and crushed time beneath her steps. Ceres's chest still burned, but her breathing began to slow. She passed the tree stump where her aunt used to dry lavender, the leaning pine that bent toward the edge of the sea like an old man bowing. At the far edge of the wood, she descended the sloped trail of loose stone leading down the coastal ridge. Her old refuge was waiting. The cave mouth was narrow, nearly hidden behind a ridge of brush. She ducked beneath the overhang, her skirts snagging against the wet stone, and entered the cool darkness. Sea spray lingered faintly in the air. She sat for a moment, letting the sound of distant waves wash over her, willing herself not to cry. Then she heard a groan. It was soft, so soft She might have mistaken it for wind, but it came again, closer this time. She turned her head and froze. A body lay half concealed among the rocks, just outside the mouth of the cave. Her heart jolted. She scrambled forward. He was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, clad in dark crimson hunting attire that was torn along the sleeve and soaked near the thigh. One boot was missing. His left leg twisted at a sickening angle beneath him, and blood streaked his temple. His chest rose and fell, uneven. Karis dropped to her knees, pressing her fingers to his throat. The pulse was faint, but there. She knew his face. She had seen it in sketches sold at the traveling market, on coins, and once in a crude etching hung in the steward's house. High cheekbones, strong brow, a mouth too firm to ever smile without effort. This was Prince Edward of Roosevelt, and he was dying. Her breath caught. She looked wildly around the rocks, half expecting someone to appear. But no one did. There was no one. Just the wind, the waves, and the bleeding prince in her hands. Panic surged, then receded, replaced by the calm that always came when someone needed her. She rolled up her sleeves and tore a strip from her underskirt. She bound his head, braced his leg with driftwood, and dragged his weight inch by inch into the cave. By the time the moon rose, she had covered him in her cloak, pressed water to his lips, and built a shallow fire from dried moss and bark. She did not sleep. The next day passed in fragments, fetching clean cloth, sneaking into the village to take a jar of lard and willow bark powder, praying no one saw her. She whispered as she worked, though he did not wake. She told him nothing of who he was to her, nor dared to ask what had brought him to the cliffs alone. Once, when his fever broke, he clutched a letter in his coat and murmured a name she didn't recognize. She did not touch the paper. On the second night, he opened his eyes. Only for a moment. They were hazel, dazed. His lips parted, but no sound came. He gripped her wrist weakly. Then his eyes fluttered closed again. The next morning she heard voices. They were sharp and foreign to the sea air. Men in boots, steel buckles. The prince stirred but did not rise. Sarah stood at the cave entrance, heart thundering as the guards found them. She didn't run. The moment they recognized him, they pushed her aside. One man knelt to lift the prince while the other turned to her, eyes narrowing. "You!" he said coldly. "What did you hear?" She blinked. "Nothing. I found him." "Who told you where to look?" he interrupted. "Who gave you the letter?" "No one," she said. "I was walking. He was alone. He was hurt. "Do not lie," another snapped. "You common girls trade secrets like milk." "I didn't." The prince groaned faintly as they lifted him, but he said nothing else. His gaze was unfocused. He didn't look at her. Saris was bound at the wrists. She was not allowed to speak again for the rest of the journey. Not on the road. Not at the gates of the palace. Not even when a courtier in gold-threaded livery stepped forward to read a proclamation in the king's name. It was a sentence of silence. Though her crime was unproven, though her intentions might have been innocent, she was declared a threat to the integrity of royal affairs. What she may have seen or heard, true or imagined, was deemed enough to risk the stability of a diplomatic negotiation not yet disclosed. To protect the crown, she was to be reassigned to Elberdon Palace under enforced silence. She would not be imprisoned, but her voice would be stripped from her, and her name with it. Her words would never be trusted again. By sunset, Saris was seated in a covered coach, flanked by armed escorts, the stone walls of Kenton Hollow falling away behind her like a dream drowned in daylight. The palace rose before her, gray, wind-bitten, and vast, and as the gates groaned open, she understood that her life, as she had known it, had vanished. She was led through a servant's passage, across cold flagstones, and down a corridor lined with shuttered windows, until at last a steward opened a door and said flatly, "This is where you'll work." Inside, the room smelled of damp earth and dust. The steward added, almost as an afterthought, "You'll answer to no one. Speak to no one, and don't expect to be spoken to. Then he closed the door behind her, and the silence became absolute. The conservatory was a ruin of quiet memory and forgotten care. It stood apart from the main wing of Elberton Palace, accessible through a narrow stone passage that twisted like an afterthought between shuttered corridors and neglected rooms. Saris was led there on her second morning by the steward, with the dull eyes and the clipped voice. He unlocked the door with a ring of iron keys and gestured inside without stepping over the threshold. "You'll tend this place," he said, as if the assignment were a punishment too low to deserve his breath. "No speaking, no writing. Keep it clean. Keep it alive, if you can." Then he left her. Saris stepped inside and let the door close behind her. The scent of damp loam and old bark filled her nose. Light filtered through the high-arched windows, where ivy had crept through the cracks and hung like tired lace. Dust floated in the golden shafts, and the air was warm, moist, still. The glass walls had once gleamed, but now they were smeared with bird droppings and fogged with mildew. Orange trees in long terracotta basins lined the inner walkways, their branches heavy with curled, browning leaves. Ferns sagged in the corners, gray-green and weeping. In the center, a stone fountain stood dry and silent, its basin filled with brittle petals and dead bees. Furniture lay scattered beneath linen dust covers, chairs with carved backs, an overturned jardiniere, a writing desk pocked with rot. It might once have been a sanctuary. Now it felt like a forgotten greenhouse for dying things. But it was hers. Saris rolled up her sleeves, pulled her hair into a tighter knot, and began to work. She touched everything with the same quiet reverence she'd once shown to salves and fevered foreheads. She pruned with care, testing stems before cutting. She swept the gravel paths and gathered fallen leaves in silent bundles. The orange trees responded first. Beneath their shedding canopies, she pressed her fingers to the soil, loosened the roots, and whispered a prayer she could not voice aloud. Each day, she woke with the birds and returned to the conservatory before the palace stirred. The older head gardener passed through once or twice a week, a tall, broad man with mud-stained boots and a face as closed as a locked gate. He said nothing beyond a grunt and a brief glance at her hands or the nearest plant. He did not interfere, but he never lingered. A young servant girl came with food at midday, setting down her tray near the door with lowered eyes and stiff movements. She never spoke. Saris once tried to offer her a blossom from the healthiest of the citrus trees, but the girl merely curtsied and fled. The silence settled like moss around her, thick and familiar. But in the garden, Saris was not invisible. The plants responded to her hands. The light deepened where she washed the windows clean. Slowly, color returned to the space. Tender shoots, glimmers of green. She was kneeling beside a raised bed of crumbling violets when she first heard the cane tapping against stone. It was a deliberate sound, firm and slow, followed by the whisper of polished boots. She turned her head, and her breath stopped. Prince Edward stood at the entrance of the conservatory, a gold-handled cane in one gloved hand, the other gripping the doorframe. His coat was deep blue, cut in the military style of the court, with silver thread glinting at the cuffs. His dark hair had grown longer since she last saw him, and was pulled back with a ribbon that matched his coat. His face was paler than she remembered, but no less striking. Brows drawn, mouth set, eyes unreadable. He looked straight at her. The world contracted. She stood slowly, brushing soil from her skirts. Her heart pounded in her throat. He took a step forward, then another. Saris bowed her head in a formal curtsy, just as the palace code required. When she looked up again, his expression had changed. First surprise, then guilt. Then something else, something quiet and tender and unguarded. He did not speak. Neither did she. He left after only a few minutes, saying nothing to the gardener who had appeared briefly at the door. But 2 days later, he returned. He came with a steward and asked formal questions about the condition of the glass frames. On his next visit, He brought a scroll and inquired whether the conservatory had ever housed orchids. Another time, he simply stood near the orange trees, gazing at them in silence as though trying to remember something. Each time, he glanced toward her. Each time, she kept her eyes on her work. But their paths crossed more often. She would turn to reach for a watering can and find him beside her, handing it without a word. Once, his gloved hand brushed hers as they both reached for the same basket. He drew back sharply, as if stung. She did not move. The silence between them grew dense. Not empty, but heavy with things unspoken. "Thank you, I remember. Do you still see me?" She noticed the way he limped slightly, the subtle wince when he shifted too quickly. His cane tapped more loudly when he was impatient. His gaze lingered on her longer when he believed she wouldn't notice. But she did. She felt the weight of every glance, every breath. In the evenings, she lay awake in the narrow servant's bed assigned to her, and tried not to remember how it had felt to press her hand to his fevered brow, how his lips had moved in sleep. How, for those 2 days, he had been only a man, and she only a girl with nothing but her hands to give. Edward's visits became more frequent. He never acknowledged her by name. He never breached protocol. But the pretense grew thinner with each day. He once reached for a dead branch above her shoulder and removed it gently, his fingers brushing the curve of her neck. She had closed her eyes, just for a moment, as warmth spread from the contact like sunlight on cold stone. But the court was not blind. Edward began asking questions elsewhere. He cornered a clerk in the archives and demanded to see the hunting logs from the day of the accident. He questioned the guards assigned to his escort, pressing them on their delay in finding him. He received only vague replies, timelines blurred, details softened. One steward mentioned that the missive Edward had carried with him that morning, a royal letter of minor import, had never been recovered. "It must have fallen near the cliffs," the steward said lightly. "Irrelevant, Your Highness." But Edward frowned. A letter, a report, something he had kept near him, even while injured. Ceres had never spoken of it. She could not. But he remembered her kneeling beside him, the torn edges of his coat, the way she had looked at him, not with fear, but with certainty. If she had seen something, even by accident, if someone at court feared that. He returned to the conservatory late in the day, after the gardeners had gone and the halls outside fell into their quiet dusk lull. Ceres was alone, sweeping fallen petals into a woven basket. Edward entered without his cane. She looked up at once, startled. He crossed to her, closer than he had ever come. His eyes searched hers. "There's something I need to understand," he said softly, his voice a hoarse echo in the glass room. She stared at him, unmoving. But he didn't press her. He turned and walked the length of the conservatory, pausing near the far cabinet where old ledgers and care records had once been kept. He pulled open the bottom drawer, dust trailing behind. There, tucked between disused garden records and a rotted ink blotter, was a thin folder, leather-bound, sealed with dark wax. He lifted it slowly. The seal bore a mark he recognized immediately, the black crest of Lord Carroway's private office. Stamped across the front in spidery script were the words, "Eyes Only, Carroway," and beneath, in a hurried scrawl, "Concerning the cliff incident, witness detained in silence." The paper was still warm from his hands. Edward stood alone in the narrow stone corridor just beyond the conservatory, the weight of the report pressing into his palm. It hadn't told him everything, of course not, but it had told him enough. A witness, a servant detained without formal charge, a girl who could not speak in her own defense because she had never been permitted to try. He leaned against the cool wall, shutting his eyes. The scent of the conservatory still clung to his coat, citrus and damp earth, her scent, Ceres. She hadn't betrayed herself, not once, not with a glance, not with a plea. And yet, every time he looked at her, something in her eyes ached with truths that had no place in words. He knew now why she'd been hidden. Not because she was dangerous, but because someone else had something to lose. From that moment forward, Edward stopped pretending. He no longer waited for convenient hours or made excuses through stewards. He came openly, sometimes alone, sometimes with a thin pretense of official inspection, but always with the same goal: to see her. The palace began to notice. Footmen lifted their heads when he passed. A chambermaid, seeing him turn down the conservatory hall 3 mornings in a row, murmured to a scullery maid over a tray of candied fruit. Ceres noticed too. She was standing near the restored fountain when he appeared again, his cane tapping softly against the clean stone floor. She looked up, her cheeks flushed from work, a smear of soil across one wrist. Her eyes widened, then softened. He said nothing at first, only moved to stand beside her. She nodded once in quiet acknowledgement, and together they bent over the basin, her hand reaching into the water to adjust a dislodged lily. His hand brushed hers as she drew back, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. That night, he left a note for her, tucked beneath a pot of lemon verbena she often lingered near. It was no more than a small folded square. Inside, a single line: "You were the first thing I saw when I woke. I didn't thank you." The next day, he found a note in return, not words. A drawing, done in light charcoal, the lines careful, almost shy. An orange blossom, fully bloomed, with its petals open to the light. Beneath it, written in slanted, careful hand: "I remember." He stared at it for a long time, fingers curled around the parchment. Their meetings grew braver. In the early hours, when dew still clung to the garden glass and the sun had not yet risen, he would find her near the arch of flowering vines just outside the conservatory. They would stand together in silence, or walk a few paces apart, their shoulders brushing in the narrow paths. She never spoke. She didn't have to. Her eyes, always watching him, seemed to say everything he had never dared to voice. A smile from her was rare, but when it came, it warmed something in him that had long gone cold. The others began to talk more openly. Whispers followed him from chamber to chamber. A page boy asked a question and was silenced with a hiss. Lady Danforth in the music room turned her head too quickly when he entered. One of the guards in the west corridor refused to meet his gaze, and then came Caraway. He intercepted the note with the orange blossom. Edward never learned how. Perhaps one of the gardeners had seen too much. Perhaps it had fallen from his coat. Regardless, Caraway read it. The man summoned Edward 2 days later. The council room was dim and still, the tall windows shuttered against the noon light. Edward stood before the long table, the only man without powdered hair or a sash. Caraway's expression was unreadable. "She is cleverer than she appears," he said without preamble. Edward's jaw tightened. "You believe she is innocent," Caraway continued. "That is understandable. Gratitude often clouds better judgment. But the girl's silence, her obedience, may be a mask. She saved my life." "Perhaps," Caraway said. "Or perhaps she used your misfortune to entangle your sympathies. One cannot be certain." Edward's temper rose, slow and steady. "You think she orchestrated her own punishment?" "I think she is not as simple as you wish her to be." Caraway folded his hands. "This is not a court romance, Your Highness. It is the business of state. Foreign envoys ask questions. Whispers of an informant, of disloyalty within our own halls, could unravel delicate negotiations. There is no informant. No. There is only a girl with a mouth that, if opened, might destroy everything we've built. She hasn't spoken. But she has drawn, hasn't she?" Edward flinched. Caraway rose from his seat. "She will be removed, quietly, permanently. She will be sent to the Harrow Ridge estate under the protection of the Crown. There, she will have everything she requires: food, shelter, silence." Edward's voice was low. "That's exile. That's mercy. He went to the king. The private chamber smelled of beeswax and coal. The king sat at the hearth, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other cradling a brandy glass. His face was worn, deeper lined than Edward remembered. Edward made his case in measured tones. He spoke of injustice, of gratitude, of the lie that had robbed a girl of her name. The king listened, and then he said with chilling quiet, "You may protect her with silence, Edward, or you may protect the kingdom with obedience, but you cannot do both." Caris did not know. She rose with the dawn, as always, and washed in the basin by the conservatory wall. She tied back her hair and laid out her apron. The sun was rising in pale ribbons across the glass. She had just bent to trim the new shoots when footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. 2 guards stood in the doorway, palace livery, silver fastenings, expressionless eyes. The taller of the 2 stepped forward. "Come with us." She hesitated. The second guard raised a hand, firm but not cruel. "You're to be escorted. Orders from the court." She looked from one man to the other. Her lips parted. No words came. She stood. They led her not toward the conservatory's back halls, but toward the lower quarters. She passed familiar corridors, the hem of her gown brushing against stone, the air heavy with questions. She was taken to a chamber she had never entered before. A narrow room, clean but bare, with no windows and only a single bed. Her small bag of belongings lay on the chair. "You will remain here until morning," said the taller guard. "You will be escorted to the carriage at first light." They left her without ceremony, the door locking behind them. Sarah stood in the center of the room, unmoving. Evening deepened. The oil lamp on the wall guttered softly. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands. And then, not long before midnight, a knock thundered against the door. "Ceres!" It was his voice. She shot to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. "Open this door!" Edward's voice rang out again, hard with desperation. "I need to see her." The hallway exploded with movement, boots striking tile, a sharper voice barking orders. Then came Caraway's voice, low, clipped, commanding. "You will leave, Your Highness, now." The chandeliers shimmered like 1,000 tiny suns suspended from the ceiling of the grand hall, their light casting golden reflections on polished marble and silk. Above the dais, royal standards draped in crimson and navy swayed with the occasional draft, their tassels whispering secrets in the high air. The scent of beeswax, perfume, and warmed wine mingled with the low murmur of voices as titled guests filled the ballroom in layers of satin, brocade, and powdered dignity. The diplomatic ball at Elberdon Palace had begun with exquisite precision. Foreign envoys from the continent were ushered in with rehearsed ceremony, their crests proudly displayed on the silver-framed cards pinned to their lapels. Ministers moved like polished cogs among them, bowing, flattering, offering the appropriate names at the appropriate moments. Caraway, the king's advisor, stood near the orchestra platform, his expression fixed in a mask of benevolent diplomacy, eyes constantly shifting. It was supposed to be a celebration of alliances, stability, control. It was not supposed to include Prince Edward, and certainly not the girl who walked beside him. He entered through the center doors at the far end of the hall, tall, unbent, a figure cut from the air itself in a dark coat of midnight blue, understated but unmistakably regal. His cane tapped once against the floor, then stilled. He stood just beyond the mosaic circle where the court dancers had been preparing their next step. On his arm was Ceres Ashdown. She wore a plain grey gown, the kind issued to lower palace servants. No embroidery, no ornament. Her hair was bound in a modest coil at her neck, a few dark tendrils loose around her face from the quickness of their arrival. She wore no gloves, no jewelry. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her as though they might tremble if she let them move. Her presence in that room was a breach of nearly every rule ever taught to her. But her chin was lifted, her gaze steady. If she feared the sea of stares washing over her, she did not show it. The room fell into a hush so complete that even the violins faltered. Noblewomen froze mid-curtsy. Lords stared over goblets of wine. A whispered name escaped someone's lips, the servant girl, but no one dared speak it aloud again. Carraway's head snapped toward the doorway. His eyes narrowed. The king remained seated on the high chair at the end of the hall, his scepter resting loosely in one hand. He did not rise. Edward walked forward, slowly, steadily, guiding Ceres until they stood in the center of the ballroom, just before the raised dais. He did not bow. He did not kneel. He only looked up, his eyes locked on the throne. "I ask for your attention," Edward said. His voice rang clearly, unhurried and deep. It traveled through the space like the first true gust before a storm. No one interrupted. "This ball," he said, "was planned to honor peace, to welcome foreign dignitaries, to celebrate what we claim to value: loyalty, justice, order." He paused, then glanced at Ceres beside him. "But what you see here, this woman, who should not be standing at my side, is the only one in this room who has shown me what honor truly looks like." A ripple passed through the crowd. Some gasped softly, others stiffened, eyes darting between the prince and the king. "She found me broken," Edward continued, "bleeding and unconscious on the cliffs near Kenton Hollow. She did not run. She did not ask who I was. She did not search my pockets for coin or seal. She dragged me into shelter, nursed me, risked her safety. And when I was taken back to this palace, when I could not speak for her, she was accused of hearing what she should not have heard." He turned to look at Carraway then. A convenient accusation, because the truth would have been far more inconvenient. Carraway's expression did not change, but a line of tension formed at the corners of his jaw. Edward's gaze swept the room. "I was not alone the day I fell. I was meeting with someone, a representative not approved by the council. I now believe that meeting was orchestrated by men whose loyalty is not to this crown, but to their own secrets. There was no threat in this girl. There was only the threat of exposure." Murmurs rose. One nobleman turned to another, his lips tight with alarm. A lady drew back as though the very air near her had changed. Edward's voice grew softer then, but no less certain. "I did not realize the price she paid until it was too late. Silence, exile, a punishment for a crime she never committed. And now they would send her away again. Because I saw her, because I remembered." He turned fully toward the king. "I cannot allow it." The silence held. Then Carraway stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "this display, however passionate, is in breach of the dignity of the court. It is also a threat to the alliances you've cultivated. If His Highness chooses to jeopardize those ties for a servant's affections, then I urge swift intervention." His voice was cold, precise. "Remove her now, or remove his title." Gasps scattered across the room like flocks of startled birds. Ceres did not move. Edward looked only at his father. The king's gaze was hard to read. His hand still rested lightly on the scepter, but his eyes were sharp, alive, probing. He looked not at Ceres, but at his son, as if weighing something deep and ancient between them. The quiet stretched. At last, the king said, "If you intend to live as a man of rank, then you will act within it. If not, then you may live as a man." He leaned forward, voice like stone in winter. "Choose, Edward." The words dropped like an axe. The court stood still, every breath held. Edward turned to Ceres. She looked up at him, eyes wide, unblinking. The flush had returned to her cheeks, but she did not tremble. He bent his head toward hers and whispered something only she could hear. Then, without looking away from her, he said aloud, "I've made my choice." The royal seal cracked open with a quiet snap, its red wax curling as Edward broke the binding on the parchment. The throne room had emptied long before, and though the air still carried the echo of whispered judgments, the weight of the court no longer pressed against his chest. He stood in the king's private study, the light from the tall windows falling in clean bars across the floor. Beside him, Ceres waited, her hands gently folded, the faint tremble of her breath visible in the way her shoulders rose and fell. The document was brief. A formal release of all ceremonial duties and titles, every privilege and burden stripped away, save for the inheritance left to Edward by his mother, a modest tract of coastal land, an unassuming estate near Kenton Hollow, and a small sum held in trust. No honors, no position, nothing but a name. He signed without hesitation. The pen scratched against parchment as the ink bled into the letters. When he finished, he set it aside and looked at her. Ceres's eyes were steady. She had not spoken, not once since they'd left the ballroom hours ago, but her silence no longer felt like punishment. It was a presence, not an absence, and it spoke more clearly than any words could. He reached for her hand. She gave it freely. They left the palace not in secret, nor with fanfare. There was no announcement, no parade. The great gates opened at dawn, and Edward stepped through them without a cloak or crest, his boots dusty from the road already, his coat plain and close-cut. Ceres wore a blue-gray gown and the same shoes she'd worn the night of the ball. She carried nothing but a small satchel and a pouch of dried lavender. The guards did not speak. Some bowed. One of the footmen hesitated, then offered a quiet, awkward nod as the carriage doors closed behind them. The scandal, as scandals do, burned brightly for a week before being replaced by the next one. Whispers fled in salons and on embroidered cushions, but they faded beneath the press of diplomacy and the heavy wheels of courtly routine. Caraway retreated to his usual role, his expression more severe, but his name no longer on anyone's lips. The king, true to his word, said nothing. He issued no decree, no censure, only silence. And so Edward and Ceres began again. The manor was a narrow, wind-bent house set among low hills and olive-grey trees, a mile from the cliffs and half a day's walk from Kenton Hollow. The windows were long and old-fashioned, the shutters bleached by sun and sea air. Ivy clung stubbornly to the stone. The orchard behind it had once been wild, but with Edward's careful tending, rows of peach and apple trees began to bloom again. He rose with the dawn, worked the soil with ungloved hands, and found a quiet joy in coaxing life from the land. Ceres reopened her aunt's old apothecary in the village square, a low-beamed shop with uneven floors and a bell that rang too loud when the door opened. At first, customers came warily, some avoiding her eyes, others lingering too long as if trying to find signs of scandal in her face. But her tonics were sound, her manner gentle, and her knowledge impossible to dismiss. Slowly the looks changed. One woman asked her advice on her husband's cough. A father brought in a child with a fever. By the end of the month, Ceres's shelves were half empty, her hours full. She spoke little, even now, a few words at a time. Short sentences, never wasted. But her silence no longer made people uneasy. It commanded attention. When she smiled, it meant something. And when she nodded, it was a promise kept. The villagers who had once mocked her now watched her with something like quiet respect. In the afternoons, when her shop was closed and his hands were stained with soil and bark, they met in the conservatory. Edward had rebuilt it with his own tools, the frame taken from the fallen bones of the palace's old glass house. The glass panes were new, but the shape remained the same, arched and high, with hanging vines along the beams and citrus trees growing in low stone troughs. The scent inside was sharp and sweet, orange blossom, damp moss, warmed leaves. A narrow table held terracotta pots, a pair of garden shears, and a small tin of saved seeds wrapped in parchment. One evening in late spring, with dusk softening the edges of the world, Ceres stood near the center of the room, her fingers brushing the petals of an orange tree. The light caught her profile, casting golden streaks through her hair, and Edward felt the moment settle over him like the last exhale of winter, inevitable, deep, and utterly still. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, perfect blossom, white, with 5 delicate petals and a burst of yellow at the center. He crossed the space between them and held it out in his open palm. She turned toward him, her lips parting in quiet surprise. "I haven't asked you properly," he said. His voice was low but steady. "Not as a prince, not as anything but myself." She looked at him. Not through him, not around him, but directly, completely. He held the blossom up and tucked it behind her ear, his fingers lingering at her cheek. "Will you be my wife, Ceres Ashdown?" The stillness that followed was not silence. It was something fuller, weightier than words, more sacred than ceremony. Her eyes glistened, and for a long moment she simply looked at him. Then her hand found his, and her voice, unused for too long, rose in a whisper. "Yes." Their wedding took place beneath a tree heavy with spring fruit, just beyond the orchard, where the grass grew soft and wildflowers slipped between the roots. The sun was mild, the sky pale blue, and the breeze carried the scent of apple blossoms and thyme. The villagers gathered not out of obligation, but of choice. The same people who had once turned their backs now stood in a quiet ring of witness. There was no priest in velvet, no crown, no golden seal. Only Edward and Ceres, facing each other, hands clasped, the orange blossom still tucked behind her ear. She wore a gown of soft ivory linen, simple and unadorned, with a ribbon at her waist. He wore a coat of dark green, open at the throat, his hair wind-tossed. When he spoke his vows, his voice caught. When she spoke hers, the tremble in her voice broke into a smile. Afterward they shared bread and honey with the guests, laughter rising beneath the trees. Children ran barefoot. The older villagers sat on wooden stools, watching with soft-eyed wonder. No one spoke of the palace. No one mentioned the past. And as twilight fell, the house glowed with candlelight. The orchard murmured with rustling leaves, and the conservatory windows shimmered like starlight. From within, a single sound rang out across the evening air. It was a woman's laughter, light, warm, and unafraid. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.